Hello and welcome back to another update as I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the south in the direction of Marinka and Hrigorivka, where there's been reports that the Russians have managed to advance a bit further after launching additional attacks on the Ukrainian positions here to the north of Hrigorivka. We see that there is a staunch difference between the northern and central parts of Hrigorivka, where here to the east in general it is less concentrated and more open areas with less buildings, and therefore it is easier to fight through these areas. The northern parts are even more so, as we see that there are these lines by the road of buildings, but in the northern parts it's largely just a few farms or just sparse civilization. Here to the southern parts there are a bunch of farms and other buildings by the roads, but there are additional roads, therefore additional buildings. The central parts here of Hrigorivka itself has a much higher concentration of buildings, but still Hrigorivka itself is a small town. It is just on a long scale. Compared to Marinka, this is a much smaller concentration, and therefore we're seeing that the Russians, when they launch attacks on these Ukrainian positions, the geographical situation is actually perfectly in line with the sort of fighting that is taking place, which is these smaller assault groups that both sides have dedicated to avoid large casualties and have less commitment to the front, while the main force is the shelling and drone strikes on each other's positions throughout the front line. We then move in a northern direction towards Avdiivka itself. We hear here reports that the Russians have made advancements and have managed to capture the full length of the road here of Sobora, as well as Sportivna and Genishevs. So with these three roads, the Russians would have managed to capture the buildings here and the area up to the railways, and with this they are very close to the citadel area, and there'll definitely be some contact between the Ukrainians in the southern parts of the citadel area and the Russians advancing and capturing this final part. However, this also puts the Russians inside of Avdiivka in a very difficult position, because if they extend too far north, then the Ukrainians would be able to launch attacks on its flanks. The Russians need to consolidate their positions and secure their flanks, and through that they need to gain control over these southern parts here to the northwest of the industrial zone. So the Russians must take control over this area here if they want to advance further on top of the advancements they've recently made, especially since the area here to the north is a valley, which leaves them in a vulnerable position if they enter into it. The Russians would have the option of, instead of moving further northwards within Avdiivka, to simply redirect their forces in a eastern position flanking the Ukrainian positions here, as well as doing a double envelopment from the concentration of forces here in the east as well. So with a double envelopment of the Ukrainian positions, they'll be able to take control over the fortified positions without fighting within it themselves. There's also the possibility of sending small assault groups through these forest lines, which would allow the Russians to, again, do some sort of double envelopment on the Ukrainian positions here to the southwest of their recent advancements. Because we see here that the Ukrainians have two main positions, of which they have forward positions here to the southwest of Avdiivka. With the recent advancements of the Russians here to the northeast within Avdiivka itself, it leaves these areas more disconnected from the Ukrainians' positions, and as such it leaves them vulnerable for further attacks or a double envelopment from both the east and the west. And the Russians, to gain proper encirclement or envelopment of these Ukrainian forces, they would need to gain control over this forest line right here. So the Russians would likely send assault groups through the areas here that they have control of to the north of Opytne and here within Avdiivka itself towards these forest lines and start fighting over them. And this is exactly why they need to consolidate their control over southern Avdiivka. The Russians need control over everything to the south of the valley going through the southern parts of Avdiivka. Otherwise, the Russians, if they launch assault groups into the forest lines, they would be left alone and abandoned if the Ukrainians launch a counterattack and manage to cut off their supply with each other. Thus, the Russians also need some sort of attack here to the northeast of Opytne to try and consolidate the positions here by the air defense military site here to the southwest of Avdiivka. So these operations here to the south of Avdiivka are all connected with each other, and the main push is this thrust by the Russians into the southwestern outskirts of Avdiivka. The Russians really need to consolidate their gains, otherwise they would be left in a vulnerable position to Ukrainian counterattacks. So far, the Russians have just recently started this offensive operation, therefore their forces have not tired down and they're able to continue this fighting even though it is in the urban areas. They've been trained by Wagner soldiers, as well as having this connection and this experience from Bakhmut. They're able to utilize that in the storming of the city, especially since Avdiivka is in these southern parts past the fortifications, less concentrated and easier to deal with than Bakhmut itself, especially since the city is smaller. The biggest threat to the Russian positions here within Avdiivka is the citadel area. So they need to pressure it more and move in that direction, because if the Russians completely ignore all of Avdiivka and push straight to the citadel area, gaining control of it, they will be able to completely cut off all of the supplies without even taking the Avdiivsky coke plant, because it will allow them to have an overview over the roads going in and out of Avdiivka. So they could simply just bypass everything within Avdiivka and go straight for the citadel area. In this case, the reports that Russian special forces are present within the citadel area and preparing for the Russians' main force to arrive would have a very significant effect on the city. Because if the Russians end up bypassing all of Avdiivka, going straight to the citadel area and gain control of it, the Ukrainian lines in Avdiivka would completely collapse. The main reason for this is looking at the city itself. They do not have any specific areas that are extremely well fortified nor heavily defensible. They have the dacha areas, which is the lowest tier of defensible positions. Then there are these individual housing areas, which are also weak but a bit stronger than the dacha areas. And then we have these areas here by the train station, which are well defendable areas. However, it is very slim and it also sparse of positions. There's the Avdiivsky coke plant in the north, but that would be useless if the supply lines would be cut, which it is here from the north with the Russian presence in Stepove, and in the central parts would be overlooked by the citadel area. And with that, the Russians could have direct fire control over the roads in and out of the Avdiivsky coke plant. The main road would be here straight to the west of the Avdiivsky coke plant, but if the Russians then start storming it, then the Ukrainian positions there would be threatened as well. So there is many options of the Russian army, and the Ukrainians' response is simply to try and counterattack and kick the Russians out of the Avdiivka area, especially here to the south. They need to get the Russians out. Otherwise, the longer the Russians are present within Avdiivka, the more they can consolidate their gains and the further they can pressure the Ukrainians. It seems that the Avdiivka has already gone past the point of no return. There's not going to be a comeback for the Ukrainians within Avdiivka. With the Russian presence here in the south of Avdiivka, they are gaining control over the high points, the hills, the elevations, and with this they are going to continue pushing. Unless the Ukrainians come with a significant force and counterattacks, then the Russians have started the beginning of the end of Avdiivka. We then move further north in the direction of Avdiivka, here to the south of Klishivka, where there is this duplicated footage. I'm not sure about the date of it, but we do see, based on this footage, that the Ukrainians likely have positions here in the first lines still. So the Russian gains here and control over the first lines hasn't been complete. And as such, the Ukrainians are launching some of these counterattacks to push the Russians away from these forest lines and regain their positions and their footholds within it. With this FPV drone that flies down on a Ukrainian soldier fighting in this direction, we see that the fighting here continues. As for the Belorivka direction north of Bakhmut, south of Kremenna, the Russians are launching their own attacks here, trying to advance on Belorivka, fighting over the heights here to the north of Belorivka, and try to expand their zone of control. As Russians recently captured this forest line here, they're looking to capture the ones here to the north as well, and getting a foothold here on the northern parts by the Sversko-Donetsk River, consolidating their gains by the northern parts in the Serbianki forest area, and as such continuous pressure towards Belorivka itself. Finally, as for the direction of Okhmelny here to the north in the southeast of Kupyansk, in the Luhansk-Kharkiv border. We see that with the recent advancements here in the direction of Kupyansk, we see that the Russians now have control over most of the heights to the east of these villages that are under Ukrainian control. These villages are all located within valleys, and as such, the Russians taking control over the areas to the northeast of these positions allow them to gain control over the heights, and as such, they can threaten these villages and pressure them from high ground, getting favorable positions, and as such, we're likely going to see further attacks by the Russians towards these villages of Berestove, Avdiivka, and Kotlярivka. All of these areas expanding the amount of pressure they can exert on these villages, where the Russians have positions here to the north of Kislivka, to the east of Kislivka and Kotlярivka, and to the south of Kotlярivka, allowing them to attack from multiple directions, especially if they move in a western direction towards Avdiivka, pressure the Ukrainian positions there. They may even be able to flank Kotlярivka from the south and bypass it from there, cutting off its supplies and possibly exerting more forces and launching their own attacks here in the direction of Kotlярivka, Kislivka, Ivanivka, and Stepovo Novosilivka. And with all of these, we see that the Russians continued exerting their influence and pressure on the Ukrainian positions to try and force them back to a retreat, or simply storm their positions under heavy artillery fire. And as such, we see that there's continuous fighting all throughout the front line. It's not a lot of advancements, but there is a lot of fighting. And as such, we see that the war progresses ever so slowly, but surely. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.